For 7 years, the Duke of Vale had not opened his ballroom, not since the night his first wife walked into the middle of a dance and never walked out. The doors were locked, the dust was left to settle, and somewhere inside that sealed and silent room, a single clock still stood, stopped at 17 minutes past 11. The exact moment she vanished. Society had already decided what happened. They said he had killed her. They said the sealed room was a murderer's confession, and the stopped clock, the very hour of his crime. They were wrong about everything, because tonight, his new bride, married to him for reasons neither of them had chosen, forbidden ever to enter that room or ask what was inside, slipped the lock, stepped into 7 years of dust, and saw the one thing that unraveled every lie London had ever told about her husband. The clock had not stopped when his wife died. It had stopped the moment she was taken. And the man who took her was still smiling at the Duke across every ballroom in England, a sealed room, a stopped clock, 7 years of a good man letting the whole world call him a murderer, to protect the wife he could not save, and everyone he still could. Stay with me. Because what Rosalind found behind that door was not a grave, it was a message. And after 7 years, it was still waiting to be read. To understand tonight, you have to understand the room. And to understand the room, you have to understand the story all of London believed. But before we continue, if you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My wife said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that tales like this truly matter. 7 years ago, the Duke of Vale had thrown the grandest ball of the season, hundreds of candles, half the peerage, and at the center of it all, his young wife, the beautiful, beloved Duchess Cecilia, laughing, dancing, radiant. And then, sometime past 11, in the middle of a crowded ballroom full of watching eyes, Cecilia simply was not there anymore. No scream, no struggle anyone remembered. One dance she was there, spinning under the chandeliers, and the next, the Duke was standing alone in the center of the floor, and his wife was gone, and she was never seen again. The search found nothing. No body, no note, no trace. And when a great man's wife vanishes into thin air and he offers the world no explanation, the world writes the explanation for him. They said he had done it, that in a jealous rage he had killed her and hidden her body and staged the impossible disappearance. Some said she had thrown herself from a window rather than spend another night as his wife. Either way, the verdict was the same. The Duke of Vale was a monster, and the sealed ballroom was the proof. Because the morning after she vanished, the Duke locked the ballroom doors, and in 7 years, he never once opened them again. A guilty man hides the scene of his crime, but the Duke did not hide that room. He preserved it. He left the candles half burned in their holders. He left a single dropped glove on the floor where it fell. And he left one clock stopped at 17 minutes past 11, and never let a soul wind it again. That is not the behavior of a murderer covering his tracks. That is the behavior of a man who cannot bear to let a single second move past the moment he lost everything. And one person, 7 years later, was about to be clever enough to see the difference. Now, let me tell you how Rosalind came to marry the most feared man in England. Rosalind Hartley was not a great beauty, and she was not a great fortune. What she was, what she had always been, since she was a small girl driving her governesses to despair, was observant. Rosalind noticed things. She noticed the tremor in a liar's hands, the truth hiding under a polite phrase, the detail everyone else's eyes slid right past. Her late father used to say his daughter could walk into a room and read it like a page of print. It made her excellent company and terrible at pretending. And in a world that preferred its young women decorative and blind, it had left her, at 24, unmarried and running low on prospects. So, when the offer came, from the Duke of Vale, of all people, the sealed ballroom widower no respectable family would go near, her practical, debt-burdened relatives did not say no. Everyone pitied her. They married the noticing girl to the murderer and called it the best she could hope for. But Rosalind, being Rosalind, did not walk into Vale Court afraid. She walked in curious. "They say you killed your first wife," she told the Duke plainly the first night they were alone. Because Rosalind had never in her life been able to leave the obvious thing unsaid, the Duke went very still. "And what do you say?" "I say I have been in your house 4 hours," Rosalind replied. and I have watched you be gentle with a frightened housemaid, quiet with a grieving old dog, and unable to look at the west end of this house without flinching. Murderers, in my experience, flinch at nothing. So, I say I do not know what happened to your wife, your grace, but I intend to find out." For a long moment the Duke of Vale simply stared at his strange new bride. "You are not," he said slowly, "what I expected." "No," said Rosalind, "I never am." "Hold on to that. I intend to find out." Because Rosalind had just made a promise she had no idea would nearly cost her life, and would, in the end, unravel a 7-year lie, free more than one prisoner, and destroy a man who had spent 7 years believing himself untouchable. She had one weapon. She noticed things, and she was about to walk straight toward the one door in England she'd been forbidden to open. Vale Court was a house built around an absence. Rosalind felt it within days, the way the whole household bent around one closed door at the west end of the great hall, the way the servants dropped their voices as they passed it, the way her husband would take the long way around rather than walk by it, the ballroom, locked for 7 years, and the single rule the Duke had given his new bride, gently but absolutely, on her first morning in the house. "You may go anywhere at Vale Court that you wish, any room, any wing, any hour, except one." His eyes had been very tired. "The West Ballroom is not to be entered, not by you, not by anyone. Please, do not ask me why." And Rosalind, who had never obeyed a "do not ask me why" in her entire life, had nodded politely and begun, that very afternoon, to notice everything about the room she was forbidden to enter. She noticed that the servants dusted right up to its doors and no further. She noticed that the Duke held the only key on a chain at his own waist, day and night. She noticed that on certain nights she would wake and find him gone from his rooms, and, going to look, would find him standing silently outside the sealed doors, his hand flat against the wood, as if he could feel something breathing on the other side. A guilty man, Rosalind thought, avoids the room where he did the terrible thing. This man could not stay away from it, and that was the detail that decided her. Not fear, not suspicion, a puzzle that did not fit. Guilt and grief look alike to a careless eye. But Rosalind's eye was not careless, and she could see that whatever was behind that door, her husband did not hide from it. He mourned at it. And one night, when the Duke was called away from the house on urgent business, Rosalind took a hairpin to a 7-year-old lock and let herself in. The ballroom breathed out 7 years of cold, still air as the door swung open. Rosalind lifted her candle, and the past rose up to meet her. It was exactly as the stories said, and nothing like them. The great room stood frozen mid-celebration. Candles burned down to stubs in every holder. A single silk slipper lay on its side in the center of the floor. A champagne glass sat abandoned on a windowsill, its contents long since dried to dust. The whole room was a moment, caught and held, and refusing to end. The night everything stopped, and on the far wall, Rosalind's candle found the clock. A tall, beautiful clock, its hands frozen at 17 minutes past 11. Every other clock in Vale Court ticked and chimed and kept faithful time. This one alone stood, stopped deliberately, lovingly stopped, at one exact minute, 7 years gone. Rosalind crossed to it, and being Rosalind, she looked closer. And there, tucked into the frame of the clock, yellowed, dust-furred, but unmistakably deliberate, was a folded piece of paper. Placed, left, waiting. Her hands shook as she opened it, and in a hurried, frightened woman's hand, 7 years old, were 4 words that changed everything. "He has taken me. He has taken me. Not I am leaving, not forgive me, taken." In the middle of her own ball, in a room full of people, someone had stolen the Duchess of Vale so smoothly that not one guest saw it happen, and in the last seconds before she vanished, Cecilia had done one desperate, brilliant thing. She had scrawled 4 words and hidden them in the one place she prayed her husband would look, and he had. He had found them the morning after, and that was the moment the Duke of Vale stopped the clock, sealed the room, and began 7 years of silence. The question that should be roaring in your mind right now is the one that was roaring in Rosalind's. Taken by whom, and why, in God's name, had the Duke never told a soul? He found her there at dawn, standing in the forbidden room, the 7-year-old note in her hand. Rosalind braced for fury. It did not come. The Duke of Vale looked at his new wife, holding his dead marriage's last message, and instead of rage, his face broke into something far worse: relief. The terrible relief of a man who has carried a thing alone for so long that being caught feels like being set down. "You found it," he said quietly. "In 7 years, I never dared move it. I told myself if I left it exactly where she hid it, then some part of that night was still unfinished, still open." He closed his eyes. "You were never meant to see it, Rosalind. For your own sake." "Then tell me," Rosalind said. "All of it. Who took her?" And the Duke, at last, told the truth he had swallowed for 7 years. "His name is Lord Merrick," he said, "and he has owned my family for a very long time." He explained it in the gray dawn light. Years before, Julian's late father had made a single catastrophic mistake: a forged signature on a document, a desperate act to save the estate from ruin, a crime that, if it ever came to light, would not merely disgrace the Vale name. It would strip the title, seize the lands, and turn out every soul who depended on the estate, hundreds of tenants, servants, families, into the road. And Lord Merrick had come into possession of the proof. "For years he simply held it over us," Julian said. "A favor here, a silence there. And then, 7 years ago, he wanted more. He wanted leverage he could feel. So, at my own ball, with his men positioned among my guests, he had Cecilia taken, walked her out through the servants' passage off the ballroom before anyone knew she was gone." His voice cracked. "And the next morning, he sent me his terms. Cecilia disappears, and Stays disappeared. I say nothing, not to the magistrates, not to society, not to anyone. I let the world believe whatever it likes about me. And in exchange, he keeps her alive, and he keeps my father's crime buried, and every family on this estate keeps their home." He looked at Rosalind with 7 years of exhaustion. If I had spoken one word, accused him, searched for her, told a single soul the truth, he would have produced the proof, destroyed us all, and killed her. So I said nothing. I let them call me a murderer. It was the price of keeping her breathing and keeping my people housed. 7 years. 7 years of a good man wearing a monster's name. Not from guilt, but because a single word of the truth would have killed his wife and ruined hundreds of innocent people. His silence was not a confession. It was a cage he had locked himself inside to keep everyone else safe. And Rosalind, the noticing girl, the one who could not leave a wrong thing alone, had just picked the lock. Here is what that stopped clock really was. Not a murderer's confession, not the hour of a crime. It was a monument. The Duke of Vale had frozen a single minute in time because it was the last minute his wife had been in the world where he could reach her, and he could not, would not, let the clock carry him even 1 second further away from her. 7 years, every night, standing at that sealed door with his hand against the wood, not haunted by what he'd done, haunted by what he couldn't do. If your heart just broke a little, if you're only now realizing that the man the whole world called a murderer spent 7 years wearing that name to keep his stolen wife alive and hundreds of innocent people in their homes, then you already understand what this channel is about. The ones the world condemns without ever looking closer. The quiet sacrifices no one ever sees. The truth hiding one layer beneath the easy story. That's every tale I tell here. Subscribe and stay with me to the end, because what Rosalind does next is the part you will never forget. 2 nights later, Rosalind met him. It was at a card party the Duke could not refuse, and across the crowded, candlelit room, a warm, silver-haired gentleman raised his glass to Julian with a smile of such perfect, genial friendship that Rosalind felt her husband go rigid beside her. "Lord Merrick," Julian said, and the temperature of the word could have frozen the wine. "Your Grace." Merrick's smile widened as he crossed to them, taking Rosalind's hand and bowing over it. "And this must be the new bride. How brave of you, my dear, to marry into such a tragic house." His eyes flicked just once to the Duke, a small, private, gloating flick, before returning to Rosalind, all warmth again. "Do take care of him. He has suffered so. He carries such a weight of grief, our poor Duke. One only wishes he would learn to let things rest." And there it was. The threat wrapped in silk, delivered with a smile, in front of a room full of people who heard only an old friend's sympathy. Rosalind smiled back just as sweetly. "Oh, I don't think he'll rest, my lord. I think he's only been waiting for someone to help him carry it." Something flickered behind Merrick's eyes. Then he laughed and moved on, and the moment passed. But Rosalind had seen it. She had watched a smiling man press his thumb into her husband's oldest wound purely for the pleasure of it. And she had watched Julian, the great Duke of Vale, be forced to stand and take it in silence. That was Merrick's whole power, not a weapon he swung, but a leash he never had to pull, because the Duke had spent 7 years too afraid to test it. It was a masterpiece of control, and, Rosalind thought, watching him laugh his way across the room, it had exactly one flaw. Lord Merrick had built his entire cage around silencing the Duke. He had never once thought to account for the Duke's wife. Because why would he? Rosalind was nobody. A plain, unimportant girl married off to a monster, beneath notice, beneath suspicion, beneath the attention of a great and careful man like Lord Merrick. And that, as it turned out, was the most dangerous mistake he ever made. Because the person everyone underestimates is the person who can walk right up to the truth while no one bothers to watch. Merrick had spent 7 years watching the Duke. He never thought to watch the noticing girl at all. "We are not going to keep his secret," Rosalind said. "We are going to take away his power to hold it." The Duke shook his head, 7 years of hopelessness in the gesture. "You don't understand. The proof of my father's crime, the moment it surfaces, everything falls. Cecilia, the estate, every family on it. I have turned this over 10,000 times, Rosalind. There is no move. That is why I have not moved." "There is no move," Rosalind agreed. "As long as you are playing his game, defending, hiding, keeping quiet, and hoping he stays satisfied." She leaned forward, and there was a light in her eyes he had not seen in 7 years of gray. "So, we stop playing his game. You've spent 7 years asking how to keep his secret safe. I'm going to ask a different question entirely." She smiled. "How does a man like Lord Merrick get a thing like that proof, and hold a woman prisoner for 7 years, and do it all without ever getting his own hands dirty? He doesn't. Men like Merrick always have other victims, other secrets, other people they've ruined and buried and paid to stay quiet." She stood. "I don't need to protect your father's crime forever, Julian. I need to find enough of Merrick's crimes that the moment he reaches for his weapon, he hangs himself with it. I need to make his one secret worthless by burying it under 10 of his own." Do you see the turn? For 7 years, the Duke had played pure defense, protecting the one weakness Merrick held, and losing a little more of his life every year. It took the noticing girl, the one nobody thought to watch, to see the obvious thing he was too close and too frightened to see. You do not win by guarding your secret better. You win by making the other man too busy drowning in his own to ever use it. And Rosalind, underestimated and invisible, was perfectly placed to go hunting. What followed was the quietest war in England, and Rosalind was nobody, and she used it like a key. A plain, unimportant duchess asks a great many questions at a great many teas, and no one thinks a thing of it. She listened to gossip the way a jeweler listens for a flaw, and wrote to the ruined families and dismissed servants of every soul Lord Merrick had ever crossed. Because a man does not learn to steal a duchess and buy a household silence without a great deal of practice. And slowly, invisibly, the pattern surfaced. A merchant ruined into his grave on a forged debt. A young lord blackmailed for years over a manufactured secret, and one name that stopped Rosalind's pen cold. A physician named Daniel Ashby, framed for a theft he never committed, stripped of his name, and then made to vanish. 7 years ago, the very season Cecilia disappeared. A physician, made to disappear 7 years ago. The same season as Cecilia. He didn't only take her, Rosalind realized, her heart beginning to pound. He needed someone to keep her alive and hidden and cared for, all those years, somewhere no one would look. He needed a ruined man with nowhere else to go, and a life he could hold hostage. She had not only found the pattern of Merrick's crimes, she had found the thread that led to where Cecilia was still alive. The noticing girl had done what 7 years and all a duke's despair could not. She had found Merrick's other victims, enough of them to build a noose, and buried in that list of the ruined was a framed vanished physician who, Rosalind was suddenly certain, had spent 7 years in some forgotten house, keeping the stolen Duchess of Vale alive. find Daniel Ashby, and she would find Cecilia. All she had to do now was reach them before Merrick understood that for the first time in 7 years, someone was hunting him. They found it through the physician. Rosalind traced Daniel Ashby the way she traced everything, through the small, overlooked details, the supply orders for a remote house that should have stood empty, the quiet payments to a place at the far edge of Merrick's lands. And one gray afternoon, with the Duke's most trusted men and a magistrate's warrant born of Rosalind's mountain of evidence, they rode to a shuttered manor at the end of a forgotten road. Cecilia was there, older, thinner, 7 years grayed, but alive, and standing protectively beside a quiet, careworn man with a physician's hands. Daniel Ashby, the ruined doctor Merrick had trapped there to keep her. The reunion was not the one the songs would write, because 7 years is a long time, and Cecilia, when she saw the Duke, wept with relief and gratitude and old love, but she did not run into his arms. "Julian," she said through her tears, "you came. After all this time, you came." And then gently, with her hand finding the physician's, "But you must understand what these 7 years have been." Because Cecilia had made her own choice, in the dark, all those years. When Merrick had offered, early on, to let her send word, to trade her freedom for the Duke's public ruin, she had refused. She had chosen to stay vanished, to protect the hundreds of families on the estate exactly as Julian was protecting her, each of them unknowing, sacrificing for the other across 7 years of silence. And in that long captivity, she and Daniel Ashby, 2 prisoners of the same cruel man, keeping each other alive and sane and human, had, slowly, fallen in love. "You gave up everything to keep me breathing," Cecilia said to the Duke, holding his hands one last time as a wife. "And I gave up everything to keep your people safe. We were both so busy saving each other that we lost the years between. I will love you all my life for what you did, Julian. But my heart learned to live again in that house. It learned to live with him." And here is the mercy in it. The Duke of Vale, who had spent 7 years frozen at 17 minutes past 11, unable to let a single second move past the moment he lost her, looked at his first wife, alive and free and loved, and felt the clock inside his own chest, at long last, begin to move. She was safe. She was happy. And the strange, quiet marriage he had walked into by arrangement, with a noticing girl who could not leave a locked door alone, had somehow become the thing that set them all free. Lord Merrick learned it was over far too late to stop it. He came to Vale Court expecting the usual game, a little gloating as reminder of the leash. He found instead the Duke of Vale standing tall and unafraid for the first time in 7 years, his stolen wife safe beyond Merrick's reach, and a plain, unimportant duchess laying a thick folder on the table between them. "You'll want to threaten us now," Rosalind said pleasantly. "The proof of the old forgery. Produce it, ruin the estate, the usual. Please, do." She tapped the folder. "Because the moment you do, it goes in beside all of this. Statements from the Thornbury family, whose merchant father you ruined into his grave, from Lord Ashby's kin, from the physician you framed and imprisoned, who is, at this moment, giving a magistrate a very detailed account of a stolen duchess he was forced to keep for 7 years. She tilted her head. "You built your whole life on one rule, Lord Merrick, that your victims would stay silent out of fear, and you were right about all of them, except that you never thought to be afraid of me. You watched my husband for 7 years. You never once watched his wife." The color drained from Lord Merrick's face, because his single secret, the forgery, was only a weapon so long as it was the only card on the table. Rosalind had just laid down the entire deck. Expose the Vale forgery now, and he exposed himself to a dozen counts of extortion, fraud, false imprisonment, and the 7-year abduction of a peer's wife. His one card was worthless. He was not holding a weapon anymore. He was holding a confession. 7 years of untouchable power, undone not by a duke's strength, but by a noticing girl's patience. Because the thing about a man who silences everyone through fear is that he only has to miss one person unafraid enough and overlooked enough to gather all the whispers into one roar. Merrick had built a perfect cage and forgotten to lock the smallest door. Lord Merrick fell the way such men always fall, all at once and completely. The evidence Rosalind had gathered joined now to the testimony of Cecilia and Daniel, and every family Merrick had ruined buried him. He was arrested for the abduction of the Duchess of Vale, for extortion, for fraud, for the ruin of a dozen lives. The old forgery of Julian's father, the weapon Merrick had held for a generation, was quietly rendered harmless in the flood of far greater crimes, a footnote no one cared to pursue against a family everyone now pitied and admired. And the truth of that night, 7 years ago, spread through London the way the lie once had. How the Duke of Vale had not murdered his wife, had lost her to a monster, and worn the blame for 7 years to keep her alive and his people safe. How the stolen Duchess had refused her own freedom to protect strangers. How a plain, overlooked new bride had walked into a house of secrets and, simply by refusing to stop looking, set every prisoner in the story free. The Duke of Vale was not a monster. He never had been. And at last, all of England knew it. Cecilia and Daniel married quietly, far from London, in a small house where no one knew the Duchess of Vale had ever been anything but happy. The Duke gave them his blessing, and a home, and his lifelong friendship, and closed, gently and forever, the 7 years that had frozen him. And on the evening it was all finished, Rosalind found her husband standing in the ballroom, the doors thrown wide now, the windows open, 7 years of dust swept out, candlelight and fresh air moving through a room that had been holding its breath for the better part of a decade. He was standing before the clock. As Rosalind watched, the Duke of Vale reached out, and, for the first time in 7 years, he wound it. The hands trembled and caught and began softly to move. 17 minutes past 11 slipped quietly into the past, where it belonged. "You could have left it stopped," Rosalind said gently. "I kept that clock frozen for 7 years," Julian said, "because I could not bear to move forward from the last moment I had something to protect." He turned to her, and there was a lightness in his tired face she had never seen. "And then a woman I did not ask for and did not deserve picked the lock and looked closer and gave me everything back. Cecilia's freedom, my name, my people." He took her hands. "You gave me back time, Rosalind. I should very much like to spend the rest of it learning to deserve you." Rosalind, the noticing girl, the one everyone had, and married off and pitied and overlooked, looked at the clock, ticking softly forward at last, and then at the man who had waited 7 years for someone to simply look. "I noticed you, Julian," she said, "from the very first night. I noticed that a monster doesn't flinch, and you flinched at everything you loved." She smiled. "I think I should like to spend the rest of my time being noticed back. So here is what I want you to carry with you tonight. For 7 years, the whole world looked at the Duke of Vale and saw a murderer. They saw a sealed room and a stopped clock and a silent man, and they built a monster out of it, because a monster was an easier story than the truth. They were so certain, and they were wrong about every single thing. The sealed room was not a crime. It was a wound. The silence was not guilt. It was the loudest kind of love there is. A man giving up his own good name for 7 years to keep the people he loved alive. And the stopped clock was not the hour of a murder. It was a monument to the exact moment a good man's world stopped turning. And the one person who saw the truth was not the cleverest or the most powerful. She was the one the whole world had overlooked, and who used exactly that to walk right up to a truth no one else would look at, and refuse to glance away. So, the next time the world is certain about someone, certain they're guilty, certain they're cold, certain they're a monster, be the one who looks closer. Be the one who notices that the story everyone believes has a detail that doesn't fit. Because the easy story is almost never the true one, and the truth, as it so often does, is hiding exactly one layer beneath. Sometimes a locked door isn't hiding a crime. Sometimes it's hiding a heart that broke and never learned how to start again, until someone finally cared enough to look. If the Duke and Rosalind's story moved you tonight, if you believe the ones the world writes off, the quiet ones carrying secret sacrifices no one ever sees, deserve to finally be seen, then you're exactly who I make these stories for. You're my kind of person. Subscribe and turn on the bell so the next one always finds you. And tell me in the comments, did you guess what the stopped clock really meant? And would you have opened that door? I read every single one.